that one. I like that one.
No. Mute everybody just to make sure nothing surprising happens. After talking about blowing my nose on audio, I should extend the courtesy to everyone. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming today. This is going to be very exciting. Adam is here. He's going to be talking about progressive delivery. Adam's worked with a number of startups. He's also worked at GitHub, and he can tell you more of the things he's done. But he's going to be talking about progressive delivery, and I won't steal any of the thunder from the slides that I saw. I think it's going to be very, very interesting here. Particularly if you're coming from a kind of continuous delivery approach, as that being a good thing. Adam may open your eyes to how to maybe take that up to another level. So I'm just going to, Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you. And well, first I say that and then I take it back. Adam said he likes being interrupted. So if you've got questions that you don't want to say, throw it in the chat and I'll interrupt Adam because I'm happy to interrupt Adam. Or throw a hand up or anything like that. There may be some points to pause, but he's going to get through his content and then we're going to look at maybe having some discussion. And then we do have a quiz at the end where you can win a copy of his book, which just came out today, if I understand correctly. So like you will be one of the first people to order on the day that it was out. And I'm looking forward to getting my copy and reading it. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining today. I really appreciate the audience. And as Mark indicated, from my perspective, really look forward to engaging with you. Happy to share some stuff that gives some context, but really looking forward to hearing your feedback, hearing your ideas. I would love it if you disagree with me, because if you agree with me on everything that I say, that can be a little bit boring. So feel free to speak up. Either use the chat. I'll be trying to monitor that as I'm going through some of these slides. Or kind of interrupt me, come off mute. This is, an opportunity for you to be part of the conversation and not just, kind of passively absorbing. So with that, I'm here to talk to you about progressive delivery. Also excited to say that today is launch day for the book that I wrote with a few of my co-authors. For talking and exploring this topic. This is something that I have been talking about and, kind of exploring for the past 7 years. And, with my co-authors, we were the ones who actually invented this term and have been exploring what this means and what this looks like. And, ultimately, how can we enable people to start thinking about it and being successful with paying attention to what they're building and who they're building it for. So with that, let's talk a little bit about, kind of who I am and why you should, care what I have to say. So I am one of the co-authors of Progressive Delivery. I have been building products, process teams for about 25 years in industry. The majority of time spent has been in the areas of infrastructure and developer tools. So I've done some, kind of interesting stints at various companies. I've also been an advisor and board member for a number of other startups in the space, and really enjoy, kind of the common thread throughout my career has been, how can we actually enable people to be more successful with technology? And like looking at what that entails, what does that mean for users to be able to actually get value from the products that we're building, and from the ways in which that we're actually being delivering them to the end users. All this is comes from, my background is in physics, and as I think Mark pointed out in one of his LinkedIn posts about this talk is, yes, my first career was actually as a street performer, juggling things like fire, knives, circular saw blades, of the like. Basically, I'm just a attention seeker. So with that, I want to pose this first from a perspective of a story. This is a story that, kind of a little one that, little vignette that makes an appearance in the book, but it's one that I found that a lot of technologists can connect to. So it's Friday, 9:52 p.m. You open an app on your phone to adjust an alarm on your smart speaker, right? And you need to make sure that everyone's alarms are all set up because you want to wake up early for a flight that you've got to take in the morning. You open the app and you notice it looks different because there was an update. And you're like, oh, cool, app update, right? And then you go and you start to say, oh, I need to find the alarm to adjust it. And you can't find it. You're looking, you're looking, you're looking. And then you're like, wait, something's going on. You go to Reddit. You're just like, hey, where'd this go to in the new app? You find out after reading, a number of, threads and subreddits that turns out the purveyors of the app deemed that to be a non-critical feature and removed it from their latest app update. And then you get the pleasure of running around trying to find a solution that can help you because you have been jerked around by technology. That technology that you chose to, depend upon is no longer actually helping you. It is in fact making your life worse. So as was pointed out, Mark, this is not entirely a hypothetical situation, but I'm sure that we've all been there, right? As people who use technology on the daily basis, there's been some instance in your life where software has been updated without your consent. You have now been jerked by that technology. And I keep using that word jerk. This comes from my physics background. In the context of physics, jerk is actually the third derivative of position. So if you think about this as like the first derivative is going to be velocity, second derivative is acceleration. Jerk is the change in acceleration. And the reason that I use this term in the book is that this is what we experience. It's that rapid change in acceleration. I think the ways in which people oftentimes feel this in the real world in a physical context is, when an elevator moves too quickly or stops too suddenly, or if you've ever been in a car accident or stopped short in your car, that is an example of jerk, where all of a sudden there's a rapid change in acceleration. Now, in the context of technology, what we're starting to see is that jerk is becoming more common in the context of technology release and adoption. Where it used to be, this is a great chart that I absolutely love. This was actually BlackRock did a study back in 2012, 2013 timeframe, where they actually looked at the rate of technology adoption from 1900 to present day. And so what they were trying to showcase was the fact that when you started seeing technologies in the early 1900s, the adoption rate could be measured in decades, right? But as we got to the end of the 1900s, what we started to see is that adoption rate actually started to collapse, where all of a sudden we weren't talking about decades, we went to talking about years, then we were talking about months, and you look at nowadays, you look at the rate of adoption of things like ChatGPT or other types of AI tooling. And we're measuring sometimes those adoption rates where it takes, to reach, 60% adoption was their threshold. So 60% of, kind of populace adopted the technology. Those adoption rates can be measured in days, right? Or even hours, right? Where people are really getting that kind of visceral, viral content that goes out and all of a sudden everybody's talking about it, everybody's using it. It's having its, that rapid change is hitting the mainstream. But what does this mean for, those of us that, aren't ready for that change or aren't, kind of excited about all the changes that are coming to market? You think about this, how this impacts your day-to-day workflows and your, your working environment. And sometimes those changes are welcome and sometimes they're not, right? And so part of that is, from a user perspective, we really need to be thinking about that user adoption function in the context of how we're building products. And so a big part of the book that what we're talking about is we're talking to the builders. We're talking to the people that are responsible for building and shipping software and trying to help them actually start to think more deeply about user adoption. And so this is a, kind of a, quadrant that we developed in writing the book that, interested in, this group's kind of feedback on. But it's something that we kind of realized was that there were kind of two axes that we think about in the context of different software delivery life cycles. One is the notion of developer autonomy, right? How flexible is it for the developer to be able to just ship, right? This is something that has been, a constant concept of conversation over the past, call it 20, 30 years, where we've been like, we've heard from the developers, this has been especially more relevant, as things like continuous delivery started to enter the stage. But when we think about this, we also want to think about it in the context of how do we align with user adoption, right? And like we started out with waterfall, where the reality is that when waterfall was the predominant development methodology, especially for software, this was done because it was tightly coupled to hardware, and the hardware, because it was new, it was being built, there was no user context for it. Like, the users didn't have the ability to provide feedback or like use the thing as it was in development, or even prior to like a new major hardware shift taking place, because it didn't exist. And so this meant that the kind of user adoption metric wasn't something they really cared about. They were just more from a straight up engineering perspective, thinking about, we want to build this thing. We want to try and build this thing. And this was something where also with that was really low developer autonomy, because it was so tightly coupled to the physical hardware that was being built and a very serialized process of that development. Now, interestingly, when we started to introduce Agile, and we started to think about the notion of decoupling software from hardware, Agile actually started from this premise. The Agile Manifesto started from this premise of thinking about the user, right? We had user stories. We had this idea that we wanted to, not simply blindly, set a direction and then follow that through regardless of what, our feedback was telling us, or being able to like discern, how we would be able to make course corrections. So it actually had pretty good level of user alignment around adoption and usage. The thing that it lacked, though, was it continued to lack a high level of developer autonomy, right? This was something that was, evident from perspective that developers, especially as they moved into a cloud era, they wanted more flexibility to be able to work on individual projects, individual, issues or bugs or things like that, that weren't necessarily being dictated by their Scrum Master or by their Agile coach, or helping them to define that. It was much more of a, can I just do this work on my own? And can I ship it on my own? I don't want to be tied to a team. I don't want to be tied to, I just want to be able to push code. And I saw this, during my time at GitHub. This was absolutely something where, continuous delivery was the kind of expected delivery model for moving things forward quickly. And a big part of that was that motivation on shipping, that motivation from a developer perspective of, the number one thing I care about is making my code make its way to production. That was what the motivation was for those developers. And this was something that really drove their behavior. Now, unfortunately, with that, kind of notion of continuous delivery, we really kind of lost sight of this notion of user adoption, because the focus kind of shifted a little bit too far. The pendulum swung back the other way in terms of the developers, built what they thought was viable and important, but it wasn't always connected and aligned with what the users needed. And this was especially true in the context of, shipping things without the ability for users to say no. This was something that, kind of with the advent of the SaaS movement, and being able to have this notion of, I control the entire user experience on the back end, and I can push out changes whenever I want, and the user just has to kind of take them. This was the epitome of that. This was like, I can control that, and I don't need to worry about the users. And, sometimes I'm going to make decisions because I think that that's what's right for the users. Sometimes that's what's right for, my infrastructure or architecture, and the user is just going to have to deal with it. And this is where progressive delivery comes in, where we wanted to start a conversation and really wanted to start encouraging builders to think about this in the context, both coming from an agile perspective, where we're saying, hey, look, that concern you have for users, we really support that, and we want to make sure you maintain that. But we think that there are practices from continuous delivery that you would benefit from in being able to enable your developers to be more autonomous and be capable of shipping at a faster pace, and delivering more value to your users. Likewise, from a continuous delivery perspective, We think that what you're doing is great from a developer autonomy perspective, but we think that there are things you can do from an alignment perspective to actually better align with the needs of your users and the value you're delivering to your users. So, ultimately what this comes down to is this kind of how do we enable two separate things? One is how do you enable your developers to build and deploy without friction? And the other side is how do you enable your users to adopt at a rate that maximizes value to them, right? And ultimately, progressive delivery, this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about building the right thing for the right people at the right time. And how do we think about what is the right thing? What we've done is we've realized that this is actually, we've added a third loop, right? You've probably all seen the kind of standard DevOps, kind of continuous delivery, infinity signal or sign that, kind of is this virtuous cycle between dev and ops and, being able to think about how are you ensuring that the things you're delivering are ready from an operations perspective to be monitored and observability, and then you're feeding that back into the development cycle. What we realized is that there's a loop missing in that context, and that's the user. It's the user adoption loop, right? How do we make sure that this is part of not only what we're, being mindful of when we're, defining criteria and constraints, but we're also paying attention to from a monitoring and observability perspective. And now to do this with the kind of big shift from the continuous delivery to the progressive delivery model is really there are two core tenets to this. One is the notion of progressive rollout. So this is things like using feature flags. This is being able to take a look at cohorting. How do you actually kind of expose new feature functionality in production when your users are actually ready for it? So things like being able to make sure that you are first and foremost doing an internal staff ship of new features, new tooling to make sure that people are getting some runtime with it, to make sure that you're working out any bugs or issues that you've got, but it's running in production. Then slowly moving that to beta users or your, kind of power users who are most excited for new feature functionality, giving it to the people that are actually going to be ready for and excited for that change, and getting the feedback from them so that you can refine that new feature, that new product, that new technology before it gets pushed out to people who may be a little bit more hesitant, who may be a little bit, kind of more concerned or more impacted if you upset or, kind of change up their workflow. The second tenet that we talk about is this notion of radical delegation. The term radical delegation actually comes from the United States Navy. This was a term that was used in the Naval Leadership Handbook that was rolled out back in I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, where, ultimately this was in reference to the idea that in early days of the Navy, pre-satellite communication, the expectation was that the orders were issued to the captain of ship, and the orders were then, stated in the form of an objective, right? Where it said, this is what we're expecting you to do. The way in which that objective was reached was the responsibility of the captain to manage on ship, because there was no ability for any type of course correction or, changes to be issued, or monitoring or observability. It was the requirement of the captain to be able to do that. So this notion of radical delegation means that you're providing the controls that are needed and the objectives that are desired, and giving someone else the ability to execute. And in the context of progressive delivery, what we mean by that is we want to help organizations start to think about how are they using the information they have and the systems that they have to be able to delegate control over who gets to make the decision of when a feature is available to a given user. Let me walk through an example of that so that you can kind of understand. So if I have a new widget that I want to, kind of add to my platform, ultimately, the developer, is going to be the person that is responsible for control. at the very beginning. They're the ones that are going to dictate, yes, this is now ready for me to share with other developers. This is ready for me to share, I'm going to push this out to prod, and I'm going to share it with, the operations team to make sure that they have access to validate that it's working correctly, but no one else can see it. Now I want to actually start to think about, okay, well, who's the responsible party for being able to delegate and that is going to be able to expose this to that next cohort, whether it's the beta users, whether it's full staff ship, whatever that next cohort is. Ultimately, that's going to be your operations team, most likely. They're going to be the ones who are responsible for that because it's their infrastructure and they're the ones that are holding the pager for being able to fix any, kind of outages or problems that occur. Once that is stable and you're ready to go to the next cohort, the reality is the operations team probably isn't your ideal, person to be able to dictate when that launch takes place and that release takes place to the users. It's probably your product team or your marketing team that is going to say, hey, we want to time this with some type of, press event, or we want to do some type of marketing push around this. And so we're going to delegate that control to those individuals to be able to, launch this to have awareness to a broader audience. And then finally, there may be some feature functionality that maybe it's gated on, your licensing or, some type of, tiering that you have in your product. Well, maybe that delegation then it gets pushed down to your customer support team or your customer success team or your sales team, being able to do that enablement of that customer that is just signed on for that new contract, signed up for that new feature functionality. So how do you actually push this closer and closer to the customer as that decision is appropriate? And this is what radical delegation means, is the idea that you're actually delegating control of the who gets to see what when as close to the customer as possible. The kind of ultimate example of this is, things like if you think about permissions or how you make personal choices or personalization within an application. These are settings that you're giving access to a user to make their own choices about whether or not they're on or off. Some organizations have adopted this practice in the context of, do you want the latest and greatest version of everything that comes out, or do you want to wait? Right? This is the, kind of push versus pull, kind of dynamic that you can dictate in your software of how do you make sure that the, kind of users who are excited for the changes, excited for all the things that you're going to share, are actually being set up to be successful to get those as soon as they're available. And then the users who are actually not interested in change have the ability to kind of hold off on that. And maybe they're, kind of being able to, have to be, prompted, hey, are you ready for this change? Hey, this change is coming. We wanted to, provide you with this, video that shows you a demo of what it looks like, or this tutorial or these documents that help you understand what the changes will do before you actually implement them on your device. And so this is the idea of how do you make sure that you're delegating to the responsible party. Now, to be able to, kind of talk about how we actually make improvements and how we look for, your organization's readiness to do progressive delivery, what we developed was this 4 A's framework. The 4 A's are abundance, autonomy, alignment, and automation. Taking each one of those one at a time, from an abundance perspective, this is the idea that, we live in a cloud era. And we have conceivably access to all the resources we could want, right? But what have you done from an organizational perspective to ensure that your developers and your builders actually have the ability to be able to access those resources, right? And this also couples very closely with autonomy of being able to think about, like, are they capable of moving their work forward on their own, or are there constraints on that? Now, the flip side of autonomy is that how are you making sure that the things that are being built are actually relevant and are actually needed and desired by your user base, right? And this is where we kind of move into alignment. How do we make sure that the teams and the individuals on those teams are aligned with the goals of the organization and the expectations of the customer? And then finally, the 4th A that we think is extraordinarily important for organizations as they scale is really being able to understand automation. Now, automation has a lot of different contexts when we think about this in the context of software delivery. we talk a little bit about, how do we use automation from perspective of like automating build systems or automating deployment systems, or how do we do all of those things on the automation side there. But there's also a very critical component from an automation perspective of how do we start to think about using technology to actually lighten the toil of our users, right? So how do we make sure that we're monitoring user adoption and thinking about the workflows that users are doing in ways in which we can actually introduce automation to make those tasks easier, right? How are we actually using automation to benefit our users? So instead of having to, go through 15 different clicks and 10 different screens, maybe they only have to go through one or two, because you actually already know what they're going to do. And so how do we actually do some of that modeling to make sure that we're, again, using technology to enable our users to get more value out of our products? I'm going to pause for a second and
We've
check
got a
out
few
some of these comments.
questions.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. If you're looking, I'll let you deal with it.
Um, okay, so why continuous delivery and progressive delivery are opposed to agile quadrant? Isn't that weird? Max, tell me more what you mean, what you're asking there. If Max is available, come online.
Yeah, I don't know if the connection is stable, but yeah. Well, we also talk about developer autonomy, working as a team for a product, and maybe what I understood better is individual autonomy regards team work, but I'm not so sure that it's yeah I don't get the ground very well. I mean,
So
yeah, how could you yeah make a difference between agile and continuous delivery and progressive delivery? So what does agile means in this yeah
yeah,
quadrant?
I think I know what you're saying. I think that so the point of this, kind of was to really kind of talk about what are the things that the various different development life cycles are really optimized for. And in the context of Agile was very much still a very structured software development lifecycle, which works for a large organization in particular, because of that structure. It gives you the ability to be able to really kind of have visibility up of what are the kind of things that are being worked on, as well as has some level of autonomy down to the team level of making sure that you're able to adapt to changes. But ultimately, it wasn't really structured with the intent of being able to allow the individual developer to move quickly, right? And so this is like even just the notion of the sprint structure is structured, on some type of interval, whether, you've got a sprint structure that's structured at, 2 weeks, which is kind of the standard, or if you've got it structured at 1 week or 4 weeks or anywhere in between. The reality is that from an individual developer perspective, that may or may not actually be relevant to them. And the ability to push to production, as when they're ready to push to production, is something that was more common, or something that is typically more associated with continuous delivery. Now, I think one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of organizations, there is a little bit of a blurring of pick and choose of what they've done from a software development lifecycle between continuous delivery and agile. I think a lot of current agile teams actually have taken a look at some of the concepts in continuous delivery and have adapted and adopted them. But by and large, when you look at the ways in which these life cycles are defined, that is one of the areas in which they are different.
So Adam, I've got a question in how you're defining agile, because some of what you're describing sounds more like it would fall under safe than and things like that than what I would consider agile of being a small team of 5 people that are dedicated to giving the user what they want.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that there's an aspect of that. I think that there's like this is one of those things where I think that this is a gross simplification, and I'm not trying to say otherwise. And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to do here isn't alienate or isolate, or, kind of be negative about Agile. What I'm trying to say is that I think that Agile actually did a phenomenal job of really focused on user, right? Really being paying attention to the user. But I think that there are aspects about Agile that haven't necessarily adopted all of the kind of continuous integration and continuous delivery aspects of CD that would be beneficial, but are sometimes associated with a more fast and loose mentality that doesn't necessarily work for especially like larger organizational structures.
So if I'm understanding the chart correctly here, then what you're trying to call out with where you put Agile on here is that if you've got developers and they can only work on stories that like have a user associated with it that's going to do something for the user, they have less autonomy to go and refactor something. And on some teams, I've seen teams that do it, but they're not going to go in and just do a bunch of technical stuff because it's very driven by here's what you need to do, rather than you're saying a situation where they've got a lot more control over here's what I think needs to be done. I'm going to go do it, and I don't necessarily have to find a user that's asking for this particular piece of things. Is that?
Yeah,
something?
I think that's definitely one way to talk about it. Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Does this eliminate staging or test server? So look, from my perspective, I have been advocating for a while that the premise that I think a friend of mine, Charity Majors, who's the CTO at a company called Honeycomb, and is an active social personality. She has a great quote. She says, "Everybody tests in production. Some people do it on purpose." And I think that like this is where I've always been from a perspective of thinking about software development and software delivery, is that the reality is that it doesn't matter how good your staging or test environment is. There is always going to be differences between that and production. And if you are afraid of production, it means that you haven't set up the appropriate tooling to actually enable successful testing in production. And so like, I think that there are instances where you do want to have the ability for tests to take place and have some type of staging environment depending on what you're building. I think that there are reasons that you can come up with that that is still an imperative. That said, I think the vast majority, if you're talking about a web-based application, the reality is that there's technologies today that exist. Get yourself a feature management platform. And you are able to isolate the usage of your code down to the individual line of code level that is visible to a very discrete down to a single user. And so if you have the ability to do that, you should absolutely be doing that as a matter of practice, because it will enable you to be far more successful in being able to actually have confidence in your ability to ship and deliver. So if you are not testing in production, or you think you're not, the reality is that you're just using your paying customers as your test users. And that's never a scenario that's going to end well for you.
Taylor had a question up above that.
Oh, sorry. You're actually, what if the industry you're in doesn't actually want continuous delivery? Let's say that's because they're too many people to inform, too much documentation, etc. How do we still benefit from progressive delivery? So this is actually exactly the kind of point I was making, Taylor, with this quadrant. Is progressive delivery is actually trying to say, hey, look, we're taking all of the benefits of continuous delivery and we're making them more realistic for an organization that is more comfortable with Agile. Because what we're doing is we're actually providing greater granularity of control, right? One of the things that continuous delivery, really kind of prided itself on was that, kind of notion of just ship it, right? And the reality is for a lot of organizations, just ship it actually doesn't work. whether it's regulatory constraints, whether it's, kind of having to think about your, users' regulatory constraints, or, other things, like one of my favorite, organizations that I worked with when I was at LaunchDarkly was we worked with Fannie Mae, right? Fannie Mae, rather large, federally regulated organization. They had a bunch of contracts in terms of internal consultants and workers that actually restricted the frequency with which they could update software and required them to have a certain level of training hours made available to the users of said software prior to its release.
Wow.
So like this was something where it really inhibited their ability to be able to adopt SaaS tools because they couldn't control what the experience was going to be like. And so one of the things that they actually tried to work with us on was that like they were actually an evangelist for LaunchDarkly back to a lot of their supplier vendors saying, hey, can you actually use LaunchDarkly so that we can have greater granularity of control of when we get new software updates from you as a SaaS product. And then they used it themselves to be able to make sure that they had protected releases and they were able to do granular control for the divisions, for the software that they were providing to their end users in various capacities. And this is the type of stuff that I'm talking about of, how do we make it so that that notion of user adoption becomes front and center again? But at the same time, take advantage of the 15 plus years of work that's been done in really streamlining the flow of delivery from a continuous delivery perspective. All right. Yeah, exactly, Mark. Like this is one of those things where, like, when you're playing, the new, online video game, getting all the updates all the time can be a lot of fun. But if suddenly your bank rolls out a new website that completely changes the way in which you log in, it can be extraordinarily frustrating. All right.
My bank did something to where they put a confirmation step after you did your bill pay that I was not expecting. And I had lots of different late fees because I didn't have to click through before and now it was there. And it wasn't that it was a bad change, but it's if I could have opted out of that, it would have saved me, I don't know, $15 or something. But
Exactly.
Taylor was asking if there's a place to learn more about the Fannie Mae case.
I know that there used to be a Fannie Mae case study on LaunchDarkly's website. I haven't been there in a number of years, so I don't know if it's still up or if they've taken it down. I know that we did do some webinars with them, so there were some other resources. I can probably check in, do some digging for you, and send Mark a note, and maybe he can add it to the kind of show notes at the end. Oh, there.
I think that mentions Fannie Mae, so that might be what you're looking for.
That may be one of them. Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, kind of this notion of like, how do you get there? Right. Because I think, one of the things that we, really try to do in the book is lay out some ways in which people can take this and have some actionable, kind of calls to action that they can use in their organizations or start to talk about with other members of their teams. So as kind of one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, says, is journey before destination, right? Like part of this isn't about getting to this like end state of, look, we're doing progressive delivery. It's more about how do we start to think about these ideas and the concepts of progressive delivery, and how do we make some incremental improvements? How do we bring this back to top of mind for how we're building and how we're interacting ultimately with our users? From a dev's perspective, this looks a lot like what you'd want to be doing from a continuous delivery mindset, where how are you looking for bottlenecks? How are you identifying areas in which you can increase the efficiency and the speed with which your developers are able to actually build and deploy out to production? From an ops perspective, this is like really starting to, again, take some of these like continuous delivery ideas and start to think about this from a constraints perspective, but also from a controls perspective, right? How do you deploy something like feature management or feature flagging in the system? How do you start to look at modern observability techniques instead of just simple monitoring where you're looking at uptime? Instead, how are you looking at your the number of users that initiate a workflow, how far they make it through a workflow, what's the dropout rate? How are we actually looking at feature adoption? What are we, doing from a A/B testing perspective, or thinking about that early cohort analysis to be able to actually see whether or not people are interested in the things that we're building and how we can continue to shape them prior to what we consider done. And as one of my co-authors, Heidi Waterhouse, says, is software ever really done? And it's a reasonable question. The reality is that in today's world, the answer is often no, right? And so from a user perspective, how are we starting to actually imagine this from through the user's mindset, right? What is that rate of change that is appropriate for the user? This is going to be different if we're a bank that has, cohorts that range from, new bankers at the age of 10 or 13 when they're able to, get their own online account, up to, people who are long since retired and, are doing retirement planning. How are we accommodating those both ends of the spectrum to make sure that their user experience coincides with what they're looking for, right? If you are someone who just wants everything to stay the same and never change because that's the way that you can make it through your day and pay your bills, versus, hey, look, I just started using some cool new payments app that I use with my friends. Can I link that to my bank account, right? Those are two very different user profiles. And how do we as builders look for ways in which we can accommodate both, if that's who we're trying to serve? And then, as we start to do that, we really, the recommendation that we, arrived on as we were going through this was a great way to focus your efforts is to kind of pick one A to improve at a time, right? You can think about this in terms of your, goals for a quarter, or, maybe it's something you want to focus on, in the context of, your sprints, whatever you want to do. This is a way for you to be able to, kind of scope what it is that you're working on. How are you actually making sure that your teams, what is the amount of time that it takes from a team member requesting a resource to its delivery? Right? How are you actually monitoring that? Like, is it something where they can just self-serve, or is it something that they have to ask, somebody else has to approve? Does it have to go through a ServiceNow request where you're getting, 6 layers of approval? What are ways in which you can actually address that to actually make it so that your developers and your builders are actually capable of doing more on their own? And this is, similarly with, your autonomy of your developers to actually push things to production. Right? Now, I would never advise folks to just simply, on a whim say, oh no, day one, we don't have any of the systems in place, but let's just have, developers start pushing things to prod. No, that is not the, kind of, intention at all. But how, would you start to change your behavior or prioritize your projects if your goal was to allow any developer to push to production at any time? What would that change in your systems? What are you concerned about? How would you address those concerns? And one of the things that we try to do in the book is we provide you with context for how you can address those concerns. Because the reality is there are a lot of teams that do this today in heavily regulated industry. And so they have found ways using existing technologies to be able to do this. And what we're advocating for is you do the same, because it will enable you to better serve your users. From an alignment perspective, this is where you need to start paying a lot more attention to that feedback loop with your users, both the direct and indirect feedback, right? Your direct feedback is going to be in the form of support requests or bugs or kind of NPS surveys. The indirect feedback is going to be, how often are you monitoring, new workflows or existing workflows to know whether or not users are actually completing them or dropping out, right? This is a great way, tools like Pendo or WalkMe are great examples of, organizations that have built the tooling so you don't have to be able to provide you this visibility and insight so that you can actually adjust what you're focused on and what you're prioritizing to build. And then finally, from an automation perspective, don't have to ask the question, right? If you know 100% of the time the answer is going to be the same, don't ask the question. Just autofill that information. Help users use technology to make their lives better. And so this is, again, talking about how we measure all of these. And, the key thing here is that you want to think about how every small improvement, helps to reduce that notion of technological jerk that your users will potentially experience. And, really this is, kind of removing the jerk from your software, right? How do you make it so that your users are actually excited for the changes that you introduce because you're introducing them at the right time in the right way where they're ready to adopt them? And with that, I will encourage you all, if you'd like to learn more, book is, as Mark indicated, launched today. So is available on your book purveyor's, kind of online order of choice, as well as in some local bookstores, available in most Barnes and Noble. But also I would encourage you, if you have a favorite local bookstore, ask them to order you a copy. Would love to get it on their radar and would love to see it on their shelves. And with that, you can, provide me with feedback in the form of a 5-star review. Would always welcome that. And, would love to hear from anyone also that has some interesting stories, either with regards to how they've experienced the kind of jerk of technology. I'm always interested in gathering those stories. Or if you've actually seen some, success with adopting aspects of progressive delivery, would love to have you join us for our podcast, which we'll be rolling out this fall. So with that, Mark, thank you very much for the time, and I'd love to, hear from any other folks that have questions or comments.
Let's go ahead and get through the giveaway just so people have their chance at winning the book, because we want to get that to them. So let's do that, and then and that way some people have to jump off for something else. But so this should pop up for everybody. Are you guys seeing that pop up on your screen? Don't see any participants. So is that not working for you?
I think it just came up.
Just coming up. Okay. That's good. Okay, so go and join that if you want to participate, and I'd encourage you to participate. Give it just a few more minutes to join. This is very, very thoughtful, Adam. I've got a lot of takeaways to think about, and I'm also thinking back to a lot of projects I've seen that were very successful, and recognizing that some of the reasons they were successful were for things you pointed out that I don't think I fully gave credit to, that now I'm going to have to rethink on some of those things, because there may have been things that were making them successful that I may be overlooking as being an important part of things. Okay, so let's get started. First question is, what is the third stage of the progressive delivery cycle? Is it monitor, observe, adopt, or buy? Third stage of the progress delivery cycle. Monitor, observe, adopt, or buy. And we have 3 seconds remaining. You know what? I just realized, here, let me throw this link in here in case people want to participate and didn't come up for some reason. Okay, and the answer is adopt. So monitor and observe had 2. Now, no one voted for buy, so we've got very budget conscious people here. But why is it adopt? Why isn't observe and monitor? Those aren't it, or why is adopt a better answer?
I mean, I can answer this, but no, I mean, I think that this is how we're kind of thinking about it, is that it goes back to that notion of what we refer to as the progressive delivery cycle. Is really kind of thinking about the adoption of users, right? How are users actually starting to use the things that you've built, and getting value from them, right? I think that the ideal part isn't that they're just using them, because I think that we've seen that where we kind of force users to use it, but how are we making sure that they're not only adopting it, but they're getting value?
Right. And I think that's what I like. One thing I really like about that is if you're looking at that, you're probably looking at the return on investment. We build all this software. If it's stuff no one wants and no one's going to use, you're probably not going to get return on investment. Or you're building the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And if you're just if people are being subjected to your software rather than
right.
And
Well,
what
this is that like I've never worked on a software delivery team or run a software team that has had more resources than they know what to do with. And I think that even with kind of AI coming into the game and helping developers from a writing more code perspective, the reality is that we still need to be cognizant of how are we focusing our efforts to make sure we're adding value.
One of the things I've seen some teams do that was successful is within their board, the last thing that had to happen after testing and everything and deploying it was they had to talk to a user that said, yes, this is making me happy. This is doing something that I want. Which is a good way to make sure, if you couldn't finish the story until somebody was happy. Now, big enough organization, you can find people that are happy, but okay,
Absolutely.
next question. Which of these is not one of the 4 A's of progressive delivery? Abundance, autonomy, AI, or alignment? 10 seconds remaining. Which one is not one of the 4 A's of progressive delivery? Abundance, autonomy, AI, or alignment? Okay, and we got abundance and AI, and answer is AI. So abundance was important. Why was abundance important? Because that's the one that got a few votes of people saying they're thinking that might be the one that's not in there.
Yeah, so abundance is important because if you don't have abundance, then a lot of the other things that you're looking to, kind of impact or, solve for aren't really relevant, right? If you don't have the ability to be able to, I think back to, pre-cloud days, right? Where the lack of abundance was very simply put, there was a limited number of servers that you had in your server room. And sometimes you didn't have compute capacity to be able to allow a developer to have, access to run, to compile, let alone be able to, kind of run some, kind of branch or, kind of new version or new feature, right? So there was like limitations that in physical constraints that really did not lend itself to an environment of abundance. With the kind of prevalence of cloud, this is no longer an issue. Right. This is something where, sure, you're going to have to pay for it. Right. And so like you still need to have, from a budget perspective, fiscal responsibility. But the reality is that there is no shortage of resources available for being able to actually work on new feature functionality and work on new code.
Okay, next question.
Interestingly, just an interesting point real quick is that we did actually, like in the course of writing this book, keep in mind, we started writing this book about 5 years ago. And so in the course of writing this book, AI just exploded. And so one of the things that we actually did have to, kind of visit as a team was, did it make sense for us to actually add a 5th A and have AI be that, additional part of the framework? And what we realized was that AI actually doesn't fall into the framework, except in the context that as AI has gained traction, it has actually increased the relevancy for progressive delivery. And so that's something that is, kind of really impactful.
Cool. Okay, next question was, which of these tools is recommended for progressive delivery? Feature flags, observability, Git, or all of the above? And the answer was all of the above.
Yeah. So absolutely, feature flags completely. But I think that the thing about observability is that you really can't gain insight without true observability into how things are performing, both from an ops loop perspective as well as from a user perspective. And Git is foundational for being able to have user autonomy or developer autonomy. There's no other code repository system that truly allows for autonomy the way that Git does.
Okay, I think is that question 3. Next question, why is progressive delivery needed? The rate of change is increasing, the rate of change is decreasing, or everything has reached a steady state? Okay, 4 seconds remaining. 2, 1. And answer is the rate of change is increasing. We're not quite to a steady state, and I don't know if we ever will be.
I don't see that day coming anytime soon.
Okay, I think we got one more question here. Let's go through that. And then, what is the name of Adam's book? And he's giving you a great hint here. Is it The Plagues and Paradoxes of Progress? These are all real book names, by the way. Fundamentals of DevOps and Software Delivery, Progressive Delivery, Building the Right Thing for the Right People at the Right Time, or Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back? 2 seconds remaining. I'm very curious about this Why Nothing Works book now, but Progressive Delivery, Build the Right Thing for the Right People at the Right Time. You can get a copy. The link's there. Talk to your favorite bookseller. And let's see what the final leaderboard is. Who won? And Jibu, I think you're saying your name right. You took the top spot. So if you want to send me, just reply to something. Well, let me throw my email in here. Send me your address and we will get a copy of the book headed your way. So we got about 3 minutes left. I know some people are having to leave. Does anybody have a question for Adam while we've got him here as a captive speaker? Any other questions?
Well, Mark, I really appreciate the invite, and folks, I really appreciate the engagement. This was awesome, and please, like I said, feel free to find me on the socials, and would love to hear your feedback on the concepts in the book, and really hope that this has been helpful.
Great stuff. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. And Jibu, make sure you send me your address in an email and we'll get a book headed your way. And thank you everybody for coming. Next week, we're talking about effective online presentations, which is going to be a lot of me telling things that did not work well for me. So that will be very exciting to hear ways I've humiliated myself, but also some things that worked well. So hope to see you next week, and everybody have a great rest of your week. Thanks again, Adam.